Hello and welcome to our Stone Reform podcast series. Today we're talking about the history of stone. I'm joined here by James Watson, and this is Toby Barlow speaking. Today we'll be talking about the history of stone, how it's evolved through times. I think James is going to start by asking a few questions.
Yes, I've got several questions for you, Toby. And let's start at the beginning. So what can we learn about the history of stone?
So we're going to start all the way back from Stonehenge in the year 3000 BC. So Stonehenge, obviously a set of solid rocks formed in a post-lintel formation. They're reported to have moved 150 miles, a lot of them coming from the south coast of Wales, so actually quite a large distance moved. They were a religious site, and an expression of power was seen through these stones. Is it something have you visited Stonehenge?
I've never visited. I think I've been on the motorway right next to it. Believe you can see it from the motorway actually.
Yeah, you can. Yeah. And actually, the Romans started to take away stone from this, and that brings me on a lot further down, about 3,000 years after Stonehenge. The Romans were a large user of stone and liked to use it within their structures, and developed quite a good way of using stone, often using arches within their structures.
Do you find that the Romans used a particular type of stone, or was it the vernacular stone of the area they were occupying?
Generally the vernacular stone of closest to where they could find it, and they found that used the least amount of energy to move it from one place to the other. It's cheaper, used less men, so that's generally what they did.
So I guess a good example of that would be the comparison between the stone used in Chester and York, both Roman occupied cities, but different use of vernacular stone.
Absolutely.
Interesting. So how far back can we look into the history? Is Stonehenge the beginning of our knowledge on how stone can be used in a construction sense?
Yeah, it definitely was one of the beginnings. I think we found through history that because of the durability of stone and the strength of it, that these are some of the structures that we can still see today.
I can't imagine there's any other structures 3,000 years old that remain today.
Absolutely not. That's one of the first medieval sites that is still standing today. So yeah, definitely an important step.
It's very interesting, isn't it? That must far exceed any other alternative materials, I imagine.
Absolutely.
So referring back to our conversation a moment ago on Chester, and I think you mentioned just slightly prior to that the beauty of stone arches. Why do you think arches are beautiful, and what purpose did they have in ancient construction methods?
So Romans often used it to span large distances. They found, through quite clever technology really, that they could use it to span distances that they couldn't through a post-lintel format. So we started seeing this develop within Roman architecture, and then we actually started to see it throughout history after that as sort of Romanesque, playing on Roman period. So Anglo-Saxons used this, and one example is Brixworth Church, which is in the year 675. They used similar size stone to what Romans did, and were definitely inspired by this and the beauty of the arches that they used, especially in Brixworth Church.
So Toby, as you've just touched on churches, is there any merit in focusing on medieval castles? What can we learn from their construction?
Absolutely. The Normans used large amounts of stone, and a great example is Conisbrough Castle. And they used that stone within their foundations, so they had large stone pads filled with rubble, and evidently these have worked quite well to support these castles over the years. So quite an interesting topic of stone foundations that we'll definitely touch upon in a future podcast. But yeah, definitely.
And clearly very durable as well, the foundations. I presume, resistant to moisture changes in the ground, which is
definitely. And
integral.
yeah, these stones were built in a thick way to be strong, to protect and defend their areas that were within the castles. So often taluses were used, quite an interesting detail which you'll be able to see on our Instagram page.
So from this point in, let's say, the year 1000, how did the use of stone continue to develop, and what things can we pinpoint about that?
So we definitely started to see development of stone, and Conwy Castle is a really good example of this, where large spans were used, arch points were used, which is not something that we'd seen in Roman times. So they were able to span large distances and created, due to this more pointed form, compressive strength of the surrounding walls around these pointed arches didn't need to be quite as large, as the arches created more of a downward force on these walls rather than a sideways sort of force.
Yeah.
And we're still, at this time, we're still seeing local stones being used. I think it really started to see stones taken from further afield was in London around the 1700s. You started to see a large use of Portland stone from the island of Portland on the south coast. And this was, I think, something that you've looked into, is why in London there started to be more of a use of stone from further afield. Is that something in London?
London geographically has a clay base, and therefore stone that is appropriate to be used as a construction material, i.e. limestone, is only found further afield. Hence, the stone was taken or quarried from Portland on the south coast in Dorset. And you also see this throughout many examples of architecture in London from that era.
So yeah, an interesting topic raised, that these distances, as we went through time, have started to increase, and I think that really became apparent more in the industrialisation period.
Yeah, of course. The ease of transport led to long journeys, long delivery journeys being more feasible, really.
And abundance of energy as well, so energy wasn't a problem.
Not at all, no.
At all at that period, when you started to have coal being burned and large amounts of electricity.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it, about Stonehenge, how on earth they managed to move those stones such a long distance at that time. But yeah,
it does.
As time goes on, transport becomes a lot more easy.
I think that impacted massively the use of stone in the UK, and a good example is Chiswick House. Do you know what materials were used for this, Jen?
Yes, Sicilian limestone, I believe. It was just deemed to be more aesthetic than, and potentially cheaper than the local limestone in the UK, that is.
Absolutely, and with this industrialisation definitely came the increase of the use of concrete, and this is also apparent in the Chiswick House Cafe, where the main structural frame was concrete, and we saw then the cladding of stone used, which at the time seemed the best way of doing this. But
it's such a shame that stone's been relegated to at points in history as just a cladding material. We're still guilty of that today, and I think it's people, innovators like Amin Taha, are really trying to push back against that awful trend.
And why do you think this is awful? What is your opinion on that?
Well, stone has superior, talk about all the different types of stone that can be used as a construction material, have superior compressive and tensile strength in comparison to concrete. So there's therefore no reason why it shouldn't also be used as a structural material when it is actually even more effective than concrete.
Definitely, and that's one consideration, is definitely its properties, but then definitely today when we're looking at a climate crisis, is there any elements of stone compared to concrete that you'd compare within that?
The embodied carbon footprint of stone is significantly lower, with the only carbon involved actually coming through the quarrying process, and this is a process that can definitely be optimised and made to be completely renewable, essentially. stone is 100% recyclable, which at the end of life is a massive advantage over concrete, which obviously has its problems at the end of the life of a building.
Definitely, I think the quarrying process is definitely something we could touch upon in a future podcast. But in terms of localism, is there an element that we can talk about within the loss of localism within some of these buildings?
Yeah. There's more and more there are just generic architecture to be found in all towns and cities across the UK.
Could you call it homogeneous
architecture would be the correct way to phrase it, yeah. And I think people, as a result, have lost sort of sense of pride in their local identity. As you said, all places have become homogeneous due to this architecture that's just similar everywhere you go. But stone actually really gives that sense of place and that vernacular identity to an area, and can only have positive ramifications of being introduced again.
And Clerkenwell Close is an interesting one. And Taha designed with group work. Unfortunately, due to the lack of stone quarries in the UK that could quarry structural stone like this, they had to go into France, didn't they? So even in a building where we're seeing structural stone being used in a great way to lowering the body carbon of the building, we're still seeing stone use coming from France instead of from the UK. Is that a topic that could be addressed?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think we definitely have the natural resources to produce stone on a scale to deal with the construction demands of the UK. It's just the fact that quarries aren't currently equipped, more in terms of personnel and machinery wise, to produce stone on this sort of scale, as it's new basically. It's not what they normally do. But France, on the other hand, are capable of producing stone in large sections, essentially, as is shown in Clerkenwell Close. Hence why Abim Taha opted to quarry stone in France, or buy stone from quarries in France and transport it over the English Channel.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting point to end on, I think, and that there is a slight hope of this reform of stone already appearing within this movement that group work
of course, yeah.
and bringing to us. So yeah, definitely a point that we'll touch upon in later podcast episodes.
Of course. Very exciting.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you're able to have a look at our Instagram page, this is stone_reform.
It's Matt Davis _6969.
But yeah, thank you for listening to the podcast today, and stay tuned for further episodes.